recording. All right. This is SIG Auth for September 20th, 2017. I think we have everyone that I know of who was supposed to be here, so we will go ahead and get started. Eric, you are still there, right?
Yeah, I'm still there.
All right, so first, polls of note. There is one about trying to turn on a PSP configuration for GCE, as I recall. Tim St. Clair, or Tim Allclair, you here?
Yeah.
Okay. So as I remember this one, there was at least one subtle problem ordering. There was no PSP order if you had multiple PSP powers possible.
Correct. So all of the pod security policies that are introduced in that config, except for one, avoid this by simply not setting any defaults. And if you're not setting defaults, then the ordering doesn't matter. The only one that does set defaults is there as sort of a documentation or example policy that users might make use of or might choose to clone and make their own version of that. And I put in a warning on that, telling them to, although I guess the comments probably don't get deployed exactly. But I think since it's mostly serving the purposes of documentation, my hope was that the warning about the defaults would negate that problem.
We have some experience with this downstream in OpenShift, and the experiences around ordering, it was a very painful lesson learned. For a while, we didn't have a strict ordering, and it caused some problems for us that I think we should really try to avoid here, because the behavior does get to be unpredictable. And so things that you create end up creating differently. I guess I do see that as something that should really be fixed first, especially because it's really tempting to use the defaulting.
As Eric mentioned in the comments, I would like to make the case that we should actually remove defaulting from pod security policies and opt for initializers to serve that purpose instead.
I think that I could get behind that too, as a possible solution to the problem. But I think that the defaulting problem combined with how late this is in 1.8 makes this looks like a 1.9.
Mm-hmm.
And believe me, it's definitely a thing that I want, right? PSP is closing a gap that we have today. But
would you be comfortable with just removing all the defaults from the configs deployed in that specific one?
The thing is that it's still in the API. And this makes it. I'm willing to go back into the issue and reconsider it, but it is still so late in 1.8, and so with the defaulting, yeah, I think it's a clear. This just has to wait. Without the defaulting, we could, I guess, try to relitigate it, but the whole API ends up unreliable as a whole, right? Not the specific example that you may have, but when someone starts trying to use it, which comes more naturally if these things already exist and they're getting messages about them. They might say, hey, I need one, and oh, look, it has this defaulting capability. I'll use that because it satisfies my need. I would really worry about that being a strange edge in the behavior that we'd have.
Was this not known when the API went to beta?
No, it wasn't a thing that we noticed before it went to beta. It's a subtle problem. What happens when you have a single pass sort of validate default thing is that you end up applying defaults in the order that you're checking, and it becomes inconsistent. So it's definitely a thing we need to fix. It's definitely a thing that we can fix while in beta, but I think that we should fix it before trying to create an example for it.
Eric Toon asked a question in the group chat, just saying that now that we have initializers, we might not need to add any more pod security policies that mutate, but when the pod security policy and mission controller run after the webhooks?
I mean, it's certainly an interesting idea. It's not one that I would want to have block this. I mean, defining an order isn't actually super hard to do. We just the number of these is usually relatively small, although as I recall, PSP doesn't have range detection. But I don't know that I would choose to block on that for 1.9. Right, for 1.9, I would look at this and say, ordering is probably the simplest possible thing we can do to move this into something that can be used predictably. Initializers would be more ideal, but it would be more work, and right now initializers are not yet in a beta stage.
I'd like to note that creating an example is a bit different than enabling it in GCE as a beta feature. And you mentioned that you don't want to create an example for it until this is defined. Does your does that equivalent reasoning hold against enabling it?
I misspoke. I mean, just enabling it in GC. This was the one that was enabling it in cluster up, right? Cuba. Yeah. I just misspoke. Sorry. Eric is having a separate conversation on the chat, which I now have open and I'm looking at. We need a holistic view of webhook initializers, admission controller chain ordering. I agree, and I agree that it would take too long for 1.8. But looking at this as an opener for 1.9, I think that Jordan even linked, and I linked to his poll or somebody else's poll that attempted to actually set up the ordering. So yeah, this is Jordan looking at doing that. We can and should bug Jordan when 1.9 opens. I didn't look to see when freeze was lifting. It's this week, I think, since they extended it.
If we're considering the pod security policy feature to be broken without this ordering, it seems like a case for getting that into, not 1.8.0, but maybe a 1.8 patch release.
I think it depends on how serious the surgery is to do it. So it's broken, but it's not a regression. So if the surgery is not very complicated, then yeah, I could see backporting it. If the surgery is significant, and look at line count here, it doesn't look awful. I think it depends on the fix.
So I think one of the problems with waiting here is that essentially we don't have we don't have a way then to do the really basic block a root container, block a host network, host path containers, like those really basic security controls that kind of like without those some of the other security controls we're working on are basically defeated. And so without being able to say at a cluster level, we can at least do like those basic bits, then kind of other security controls we have don't work. So kind of like regardless of the default issue, it sort of feels like there's just a basic capability that we need now.
Well, so that basic capability hasn't been present in any state different than it is today since we first even introduced PSPs back, was it 3.3.2 or 1.3, 1.4? So I don't see that as a change from the state of affairs from 1.7. I agree that I want to make it better, and that we have known issues and starts on fixes for making those known issues better.
I think it was more of a bandwidth issue in the past. We didn't have bandwidth to figure out how to deploy this without breaking GCE, and we did the work this quarter. I'd like to ask if this makes the user more secure. I think beta is known to have some rough edges, but will enabling this allow users to run a more secure cluster?
Because of the defaulting problem, the unpredictability of the API makes it hard to use and hard to reason about what safety you actually get. Right, because you end up with a mix and match. You end up with some defaults from A and some defaults from B, and what did the user actually request and what should come out validated at the other end. So you go from, you just become unpredictable.
So do you think there's no safe way to use that though? Like if I basically just want to have a very simple policy, like one policy at the top level, that's just no root containers, no host path, no host network. Like that's the basic control I want to enforce. Do you think we can not do that with the feature as it is?
I think that you can do it, and I think that it has been done. I just don't think that we should do something like turn it on in GCE until we've actually fixed known problems with the API. Right? I mean, like it's a known problem. If you want to turn it on in your deployment, that's fine, right? Wherever you're setting this up for your GCE, turn it on. But doing it across the board for everyone doesn't seem like a good idea.
To clarify, this is only putting in the controls to turn this on. It's still disabled by default. So this feels like something that we could maybe address with some documentation describing these problems and saying that, to safely use this feature, don't set any defaults. Enable at your own risk, something along those lines.
It's something that we also need to get into EDE testing pod security policy.
Yeah.
So right now, pod security policy has no coverage. This will allow us to enable it and test.
Right. Yeah. I think that enabling a test in 1.9 would be great. I think that looking at whether this can go back into a 1.8.1 with either a fix or sufficient warnings is also good. I think that trying to cram it in at the very end of 1.8.0 just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. All right. The other one that I see linked here is adding permissions for pod disruption budgets. I remember this one. It was just a straight up add. Looked pretty simple. Did anyone want to argue it one against? All right, then I expect this one will go in. Is it going to be a backward? I didn't look to see if it had a cherry pick candidate. Does someone want this backported into something like a 1.8.1? I don't think it would bother me either way. Well, I guess if somebody asks, we can reassess then. All right, so designs of note. The Vault KMS provider. This got punted from 1.8 because it was too late to take that level of change. But the proposal is open. There is an example implementation for that proposal. The proposal looked pretty good to me when I read through it. We had worked through the plugin registry for the existing one that we have now for GKE. One of the cloud providers now has
GCE. Yeah.
GCE. Has one. This is looking to use the same mechanism and prove the interfaces out with a second implementation. The one thing that I do remember about this is that Greg specifically had questions on it. And I saw answers to those, but not responses to the answers.
Hey, yeah. So I think the Vault KMS provider is pretty reasonable. I think the actual kind of sticking point here is the plugin mechanism. So I filed a bug that I was hoping to get the Google API team to help us out with developing the mechanism. If you look at the review for the GCE one, there was quite a lot of discussion there about, is this the right way to plug it in? And so at the moment, we've got a plugin mechanism for cloud providers, but Vault is not a cloud provider. So that means that's not really going to work for this Vault implementation. So the recommendation was from API Machinery was to have a kind of out of process plugin mechanism, but that doesn't currently exist.
Right.
So,
I actually remember making at least some of those comments.
Yeah. So I filed a bug for that, and I talked to David Smith on our team. It looks like they're probably not going to have bandwidth to work on that. I don't think we're probably going to have bandwidth to work on it in Q4, but it would be great if there is possibly community desire to create this plugin mechanism that is a more general solution than the kind of cloud provider solution that we have now, because that's a problem for this Vault integration.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I thought that the way we had done it was we set it up like the admission plugin registry, where you can choose to load particular packages and install them as providers, as KMS providers, so that you could choose a particular caller could choose to compile in the plugin if they wanted to use it. Same way that we do the admission plugins today, where there's a separate plugins folder that in order to use, you have to import the plugins folder and call a register method. And once you registered it, you have the import tree and you start using it. We use that mechanism to be able to figure out what it is we needed to do things in admission. And if you look at some of our other remote webhooks, things like authentication and authorization, we learned a lot by doing the second implementation. So if a similar structure is possible with Vault, I think that's something worth pursuing. Because for instance, the token review endpoint that we use for delegated authentication, or the subject access review that we use for delegated authorization, those calls would look very different if we hadn't had the second example of the original in-process interface.
Yeah, yes, I think it's just a case of who can actually develop that plugin mechanism
Okay.
at the moment.
Greg,
Yeah.
this is KK.
Hey,
Could you ping me offline with the
I'll add
Google
it. So-
KMS? Yeah, just point me to that discussion. I'll go take a look at it and see if we can find some.
I'll put the links in the doc like right now. So that there's like a PR with like 183 comments on it.
This is Saksham's PR, right?
Saksham's one, right? And then
He had 3 or 4 open. I wasn't sure which one.
And then as a result of that, just like a couple of weeks ago, or like a few weeks ago, I filed the feature request for the plugin mechanism that is going to be needed to fix this situation. So I'll put
take a
both
look
of
at
those. I'll put both of those in the doc now.
Thanks.
But from the mechanisms you're using, I remember you had a question about what sort of auth mechanism or Was it authentication? There was some sort of question you had, and KK responded.
The question was,
About
if we add a new auth provider,
Yeah.
would the code have to change? It probably has to change.
That seemed pretty reasonable to me. Did that satisfy what you wanted to know, Greg?
Yeah, I think that's fine. I think you've got like a reasonable kind of group of common auth backends, and if people want more, then changing the code is maybe the best way to do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I will remember to chase up with API Machinery next week then as well, to go through where we want to put the second implementation of the KMS provider plugin and make sure that it does what I think it does.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'll put the links in there as soon as I can dig them up.
All right. Verifying workload JWTs. This one I want to say Mike Leith.
Yeah, I just wanted to re-announce this document. I don't know if everybody had a chance to read it. I think Eric looked at it, but neither David nor Jordan have looked at it yet. I wanted to get it back on people's radar after feature freeze because I know I sent it out at a busy time. And I was planning on, depending on how familiar people are with it, I can go through what is proposed, or we can defer to another meeting. I was also planning on re-announcing it in the next pod identity working group.
How about a sketch here? And then I think the pod identity working group is where a lot of comments are going to come in on it.
Yeah.
What this is trying to do correctly. It looks like it's going to heavily interact there.
Right. In one design, I think it will. In another design, it's fairly orthogonal. Or it can at least be developed orthogonally. In the design that depends on pod identity, of course, it is blocked by the creation of a pod identity system, but there is a design where we have a centralized server that is similar to subject access review or token access review API that builds JOTs that are time bounded and scope bounded with audiences. In that version of this, it is actually not blocked by pod identity, and kind of a extension of what the JOT system we already have. So this is an exploration of two models. One model is where we have a decentralized building of JOTs that can be exchanged or integrated into other identity systems. They differ from the JOTs that we have today in that they're scoped and time bounded. One model is decentralized based on pod identity and building trust of the JOT through the pod identity system. The other model is centralized, where we trust the central JOT minter, which is hosted on the API server. So that's the general gist of the doc.
Okay, and the ultimate purpose here is so that someone would be able to say, hey, I'm this pod, and yeah, I'm really this pod, right?
Yeah, that's the goal. Not this pod, this service count. Yeah, so that's the goal. Right now, the JOTs are painful with integrations with systems that you trust less than the Kubernetes master, because by sending a JOT, by sending the JOTs as they exist now, you give the ability for the receiver, the audience of that JOT, to act as you against the Kubernetes API, and anywhere else that JOT is accepted. This is a mechanism for moving that forward and making those safer to send around.
I think that'll help people know whether they're interested in reading and reviewing the usage. I mean, just because it's a little vague if you haven't tried doing it before, right?
Right.
I think what you're saying is that right now, if you give your JWT token out for your service account to something else to use it, that other thing now has a long-lived token that is valid against your API server.
Correct.
And you can't, without revoking the entire token, you have no way to take it back.
Correct.
Yeah.
So we want to add audiences so that I can send a token to Vault that is not usable against the Kubernetes API, and we also want to add time bounds.
All right.
And there's two models proposed in the doc. I want to get a feel for which model people prefer, and then I will produce a more detailed design of that specific model and eventually propose it to the community repo.
My initial inclination is that I really like the idea of having something based on my container identity. But I need to reread.
Yeah, I think that's possible with both. So if we base authentication with the Kubernetes API off of the container identity, then and we receive JOTs from the container API, and the JOT API is authed from the container identity, then trust is built from the container identity. The only difference between the two methods, I think that's the case in both methods. The only difference is the only difference in this case is one blocks the other if we decide to go with a centralized model or decentralized model. So.
Okay. All right. I will put this back on my list, and when Jordan gets back, I will bug him about it too.
Yeah, please do. When does Jordan get back?
He ought to be back on Monday.
All right, sounds good.
Yeah. So he's pretending like he has something important happening now. All right. So next thing on the list is the Cert Manager Incubator, and it's hard to see in Zoom. Ah, there's James. You want to talk about this? Do you have something to project? Because I think I have to stop sharing first if you do.
Yeah, I've got some slides from a meetup I did recently, so I might just go over those.
Okay. Go ahead and see if you can share now.
We also might want to note that the incubator was recently frozen, that in waiting for the elections to happen. So I don't know if that impacts this proposal or this presentation, but just a FYI.
Yeah. I didn't realize they had done that. They froze Kubernetes incubators until the election's over?
Yeah, I'll drop a link to the Kubernetes dev email.
Yeah, no, I learned that yesterday, so yeah, but I think we can carry on. Anyway, no, so Cert Manager is it started out from Kube Lego and probably the other similar project you might have seen called Kube Cert Manager, which was originally focused on Let's Encrypt and obtaining certificates for ingresses. And also with Kube Cert Manager for other workloads like pods. Neither of which has had any kind of a particularly strong identity model. And it's kind of served its job well. Lots of users have started using these things. But yeah, we're kind of looking at what we can do next with all of this. So I'll skip over a few things. So yeah, starts out, we've got ingresses. We want to be able to turn on TLS. So we add an annotation. That's all well and good. But yeah, so how does it do that? It actually negotiates with an Acme server to obtain certificates and solve challenges. So we're looking at Cert Manager now and trying to think about what we can do next with all of this. Kube Lego was heavily designed around ingresses. So nowadays we've got custom resource definitions or third-party resources and so on. So we kind of want to focus on that. And on top of that, we're kind of looking at what more there is kind of beyond just Acme. So different issuing sources. Someone mentioned Vault already in other things. So Vault is something we want to target just as a sample, some kind of a separate signing key pair just stored in a secret somewhere, potentially. Well, yeah, a number of different things. So on top of that, I opened a proposal recently, which hopefully you can still see here. I've had quite a few good comments on there, which has really started to stretch my thinking on where this can be placed, which is good. And I'm kind of trying to work out how this interacts with the existing Kubernetes certificates API. If there's anything that can be done there, especially in the bootstrap process for clusters. I think Mike Denise, if I pronounce that right, has rightly suggested that, we need to, if we are going to go down that route, we need to make sure that we're not just constraining ourselves to what kubelego could do, which is it gives you a private key, but actually more generalizing this similar to the certificates API and accepting just a plain certificate signing request and signing that. So there's a number of different things to consider now. And I think just getting some feedback from people on where we are at the moment and how all of that might interplay would be good. Just to cover where we are at the moment, we've got Acme supported with DNS and HTTP challenges, as well as a simple signing key pair implementation, just to make sure that we can implement more than one issuer. So you define your issuer specification. There's quite a lot of comments in here, and this is not a tool of finding spec. I think it might be changed in the actual spec slightly. But yeah, we define an issuer that is able to actually hand out certificates, and then users create certificate resources, which are more akin to certificate signing requests. At the moment, we're kind of layering a thin abstraction on top of CSRs with the domains field. This sort of thing, I think, is going to change and develop into more common names, alt names, and then kind of expanding beyond that, key usages and so on. But I think this kind of goes back to the discussion point on should we just accept CSRs like base64 encoded at least some level in our API, or can we just piggyback on the existing certificates API for it? So other things that we are looking at there as well is kind of adopting at least some kind of a similar mechanism to the certificates API with an audit trail. So I really like what is there at the moment, where we can see who created the request and when it was last changed and so on. So that sort of thing. And eventually I think proposing that we move into Kubernetes Incubator, if we can kind of find a common position for this, that all of these different projects that have come up to solve the problem have tried to address. I think some guys at Giant Swarm, what a call we had yesterday around this, were saying they use a similar thing, cert operator, to issue certificates for their Kubernetes clusters. They run Kubernetes within Kubernetes for customers. And I think with some adaptations to this, mostly just trying to align it with the CSR spec, this could kind of fall into place there. So, yeah. We're kind of looking for incubators on the SIG on the now closed incubator stuff. So hopefully when that opens up again, we can reconsider potentially moving into there. But I don't know if there's any questions from people on the whole project or thoughts. Thank you.
So there are a lot of projects. You mentioned a few that are in this space. I haven't looked at very many of them. I don't know if let's see. We have our CSR endpoint. Is that also you, Mike? CSRs?
Yeah.
Yeah. Have you looked at what some of these other projects he's mentioned, what they do?
Yeah, I have. I think they target different use cases. Our certificates API, I think, is not conceivably going to issue publicly trusted certificates in the near term. I see a lot of value in stuff like kubelego and Kube Certificates Manager, being able to provision less encrypt certs for ingress and other publicly facing services. I have some security. I don't know if these projects target or plan to target workload identity or container identity. And I'd like to note that the development on the CSR APIs is kind of up in the air depending on where we decide to go with pod identity. If we decide to make that X509 backed, for instance, that could inform the future direction of the CSR APIs. So at this point, I'd like to keep the certificate APIs separate from building certificates for ingress controllers.
Right. Our CSRs would be for internal cluster things like nodes. Do you see them extending to something like services that are not exposed via ingresses?
Potentially.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
It probably depends also on the container identity stuff.
Yeah, it does. Where we see that going. I think that is possible, but dependent on decisions in container identity and SPIFFE and Istio and the other stakeholders. So as far as public serving certificates, I think that's very useful. The secrets mechanism is a distribution through secrets mechanism is a little worrisome and painful. I also don't like how these public, if we are using the ingress controller and how it is deployed today, these publicly trusted certificates and private keys are available on the file system of every single node. That's a little bothersome. I would like potentially to move to deployments where if we were using something like this, we would isolate ingress to dedicated machines and only allow secrets to be pulled from those dedicated machines. The other thing is that I think is a question for the Bootstrap committee that has come up recently and is one of the reasons why we've halted incubation is I don't know if it's very clearly defined where the Kubernetes ecosystem begins and the Kubernetes project ends. So whether this is an ecosystem project and needs to be in the org, what it means to be in the org, is it an endorsement to be under the GitHub/Kubernetes organization? I think those are all open questions to be decided by the committee once it forms.
So James, I think my answer is I found you the right guy.
I do think this is the right SIG. If we move forward with this, SIG Auth is probably the right SIG.
Yeah.
The only thing I'd like to add to that is that we don't specifically target publicly signed certificates, and we also don't specifically target ingress controllers mounting it in. Kind of how these are used isn't so much a concern. At the moment, as Mike said, we target secret resources. I think the delivery mechanism is definitely something to be considered. It's not something we want to get particularly involved in, but it's open to looking at alternatives. Secrets right now seem to make sense with them being semi-secret and the advancements going on there. But yeah, absolutely acknowledge all of those points.
All right. So moving on, just to the very last thing, I don't think I'm going to bother switching the projection back on. Support unequivocal deny in a union authorizer. This is basically a way to, similar to how we union authenticators, it's a way to union an authorizer so that the authorizer can say, no, not this, and can deny the request without passing it through to the rest of the chain. I don't remember who opened this, but it seems like a pretty reasonable thing to do to me.
Yeah, that was me as well. So we have an issue where I'm not sure if this is a GK only problem, but we give our users master role so they can do whatever they want to clusters in GKE. But we do want to prevent users from breaking components that we control. Most of these components live in the kube system namespace. So doing stuff like deleting the kube system namespace, deleting kubedns, these are things that we want to prevent the user from doing, and we think that it's reasonable to assume that the user did not mean to do these things. With the current model of authorizers, this doesn't fit, since it is an OR relationship between authorization decisions between different authorizers. An alternative to this would be to use an admission controller, but it feels heavyweight. I think that the current union authorizer is very simple logically, which had its benefits in the beginning, and there was no use case for this unequivocal deny, but we have arrived on a use case, so I was hoping to get some thoughts on whether this would be a reasonable addition of functionality.
Yeah, I mean, not getting into the how I feel about particular usages of it, I think it's a reasonable thing to do. The only thing I would worry about is trying to build some sort of sane config around that. So whenever you open the poll that goes to implement something like this, I think I'd want to see how you would wire that up with flags.
Right, the ordering matters. So
ordering begins to matter, and where you actually put the union in there can matter. If you want to support like a nested union.
So Ryan had a suggestion on the thread, which was set aside how we do the compatibility, but like going forward, do anding instead of oring, how that would address all the needs, and it would not have ordering as an issue, and it would make it so that it's consistent with how we do admission control.
I don't know that I like the idea of forcing every authorizer to agree that something is allowed. Right? I think about...
Yeah, we would have to document it as like yes means I don't have an opinion, or yes. Or you could rename it to like don't care and no if you want.
Okay. Yeah, I guess we can niggle over how it's built, but the idea I think is sound of something that can come in and say, no, this is denied. Seems like a very reasonable thing to build. The only thing I was concerned about is how we spell it in the config.
Yeah, I just think that I think I'm glad we agree we need to be able to say definitely deny. I think the question is whether or not to go with a tri-state model, which then opens up a lot of other questions, or go with a and only model, which doesn't allow us to go to those other questions.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
The and only model doesn't make sense to me off the bat. So imagine IAM and RBAC integrating, and I have some IAM roles that match and allow specific actions on a cluster. But then there's a bunch of roles there's a bunch of actions I could take against IAM that don't match any rules. How would IAM be able to not return true all the time on an allow-based system?
You're saying, so for resources that IAM has no opinion about, then it would just return yes, and only if the other guy says yes, is it going to be allowed?
But they're both allow-based systems. So I can say that I allow things and the default is deny. So I would have to change RBAC to be a system where I could say these things are denied. And I would have to
add a shim there that says, like, between you and IAM, that says only send this request to IAM if this object is within the universe of things that IAM handles. And if it doesn't, you just short circuit and send back a yes.
And how would I represent that?
As a little wrapper around your webhook, inside your webhook that talks to IAM.
But how would I know if it's in the IAM universe? How would that shim know whether an object is in the IAM universe?
I think we'd have to go into a more concrete discussion of how you want these two things to work together to see if that works or not.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable. Let's explore both.
But
my main point was I think we should do one of the two. Brian asked me to promote his idea, and so I think it also makes sense. But I like doing one or the other.
We should talk about this further on the bug. I missed Brian's comment.
Yeah, I think we should talk about this probably in the issue or that's open up. But in principle, yeah, the idea of having a deny, there's going to be maybe some issues wiring that in with the subject rules review because things get a little bit unusual. But we solve those issues, then in principle, I see nothing wrong with having a different way to wire it. All right, so unless anybody has something they think is going to take about 5 minutes, I think we're going to go ahead and call it here. All right, good to talk to you guys. And I will take care of my follow-up with API machinery and take a look at the JWT and the union authorizer stuff. I will see you guys later.
Thanks.